Castro, and you are watching KALM TV, the news at 4. With the new rural housing guidelines on the horizon, the issue of one-off housing in Ireland is once again raising concerns and conflicting opinions around the country. While many fiercely defend their right to build in the countryside, the environmental experts warn about the many environmental impacts that are associated with the spread of lone housing in rural areas. And so the question remains about one-off housing. Is it a fundamental right or environmental blight?
The Irish countryside. Peace, natural beauty, productivity. It's not difficult to understand why rural living is so deeply rooted into our country's history and culture. Mark Corrigan is just one of many who dream of building a home and life in the countryside, but so far has not been able to obtain planning permission to build in the rural area in which he grew up.
Well, I played here as a kid. I worked and bled on these fields. I want my kids to be able to live and experience life here just as I did. Even though the farm has been sold, my parents still live in the family house on the farm, and they're getting on in age, so I would love to be able to remain close to them. This is the land my parents gave me to build my family home. With the planning permission being denied, the question remains, where do I go now?
Mr. Corrigan now faces the fact that the countryside dream is not always as beautiful or easy as one might think. The uncomfortable truth is that lone rural housing is the source of many social and environmental impacts, and planning restrictions are in place in an effort to slow down the spread of this uniquely Irish phenomenon. The Irish people wonder if it will ever be possible to achieve a satisfying compromise, one that finds a balance between the need to protect our environment and the respect for rural living and traditions.
Joining us this evening to discuss one-off housing in Ireland, we have Ms. Katie Larkin from the Environmental Protection Agency, Ms. Lily Corcoran, Planning Officer for Waterford County Council, and Mr. Corrigan, whose story we've just been introduced to. Ms. Larkin, environmental concerns are often brought up as one of the key problems surrounding this topic. What is the real nature and magnitude of these environmental impacts?
Hi Anna, thanks so much for having me here today to weigh in on this sensitive issue. The right to self-build in the countryside has subsequently led to one-off housing becoming a ubiquitous feature across the Irish landscape, which unfortunately has had negative consequences for the environment. Right now, unfortunately, Ireland faces major challenges in achieving the legally binding obligations set out by the Water Framework Directive. Our groundwater resources are at much risk as our surface waters, and individual septic tank outflow from one-off housing is largely responsible for this. Statistics show that over 80% of households in rural areas, which is actually a third of Ireland's population, treat and dispose of wastewater effluent on-site through septic tanks or other domestic wastewater treatment systems. The discharge from these septic tanks is estimated to be in the range of 200 to 300 million litres per day. And this is actually the equivalent of 84 Olympic swimming pools of unregulated human waste. In 2022, 49% of septic tank treatment systems inspected by the EPA actually failed inspection because they were not built or maintained properly. The issue with this is that faulty septic tanks pose a risk to human health and to the environment. They can pollute watercourses with excess nutrients and can contaminate household drinking water supplies with harmful bacteria such as fecal coliforms. Now I'll just move on to the impact that rural one-off housing has on greenhouse gas emissions. So our current settlement pattern, if continued, will actually put further pressure on transport demand. Isolated housing tends to be car dependent because public transport is often not readily available in rural areas. This increases fuel consumption and emissions, which contributes to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Generally, those living in rural one-off housing have a 64% higher travel time to services than those residing in urban areas. The EPA warns that the transport sector emissions are projected to increase by 20% over the period between 2020 and 2035. Increased demand for private car use that follows on from one-off housing developments also increases the average carbon footprint for residents living in this type of dwelling.
And what about the overall potential damage to the landscape?
One-off housing actually generates disproportionate land take and can damage the landscape. This subsequently impacts local ecosystems and biodiversity. The scattered nature of one-off housing leads to habitat fragmentation and to the removal of vital wildlife corridors. This effect is amplified when rural road networks are taken into consideration as well. Clearing land for housing can also lead to soil erosion, loss of topsoil, and increased susceptibility to landslides. Overall, the ability of land to support natural vegetation is reduced, again impacting the success of local flora and fauna. Another issue, which also happens to tie in with water quality, is the enrichment of surface waters with nutrients from effluent runoff. This can cause eutrophication of waterways, which can lead to fish kills, which leads to subsequent economical impacts.
Mr. Corrigan, as one of the many people around the country who have struggled to obtain permission to build in a rural area, could you tell us a little bit more about your situation and what has motivated you to become so vocal about this topic?
Thanks for having me. First, I would like to say that I don't disagree with Katie regarding the environmental impacts of one-off housing. I do, however, think that the social and human element should be considered. The current guidelines somewhat consider the social and human element, but pressure is being placed on the county councils to look strictly at possible environmental concerns. Since I've been denied planning permission, the question remains, what will my family do? Due to the current housing and cost of living crisis, there are not many options. There are very few houses to buy close to town that don't cost $500,000 all in. I can't build near town as the land is too expensive, and renting is outrageously expensive, as we all know. The new guidelines should have an emphasis on both environmental impacts and the social and human element. If the guidelines make it impossible to build and live in the countryside, then operational farms will decrease, and if farms are decreasing, then where do we get the milk for our evening cup of tea and the steak for your dinner? We can't forget that farmers built this country.
Ms. Corcoran, as a planning expert, could you give us your perspective on the complexity of this issue? Why is it taking so long to publish these new guidelines that are currently under development?
Hi Anna, thank you for having me. As we know, unlike most European countries, Irish planning policy has facilitated widely dispersed rural settlement patterns. As Katie has mentioned, settlement patterns of this kind have negative impacts on the environment and on the ecosystem services that we all avail from as a collective population. However, after hearing both sides from the story from Katie and Mark, we can see how difficult it has been to reach a conclusion that has minimal impact on the environment while also being fair to the potential homeowners. The incoming rural housing guidelines is a sensitive piece of legislation, and it affects both potential future residents and current residents of the rural areas. The rural housing guidelines at the moment are being prepared by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. The goal of the incoming legislation is to outline necessary regulations to be used in rural home development plans, address environmental issues regarding one-off housing, and provide a framework for sustainable managing rural housing. These guidelines will not prevent future development plans in any way. If anything, they will continue to allow rural housing developments based on specific considerations. There are reasons why these considerations are in place, and the major reason is to prevent the overdevelopment of rural areas. And of course, the publication of these guidelines has been delayed several times, and I truly understand how aggravating that must be. However, they have been delayed due to the amount of care that has been put into these guidelines. We must ensure that these guidelines comply with not only environmental legislation, but also are not in opposition of the freedoms of the EU. On top of that, the draft must go through legal reviewing and must have ministerial approval. When all of that has been completed, only then the guidelines shall be published to the public.
Could you give us some insight on the possible reasons why someone like Mr. Corrigan here might have been denied planning permission?
Well, firstly, I'd like to make clear that being denied planning permission is in no way a personal attack, and we are just following the rules, regulations and guidelines that are in place for good reason. There are many reasons why someone may be denied planning permission in Ireland, such as overdevelopment, environmental impact, environmental protection, restriction of road access and personal details such as age, health and your planning history. Now, if you are a person like Mr. Corrigan, who has resided in a rural area for 12 to 16 years of his life, then the chance of being granted planning permission for one-off housing increases. However, Mr. Corrigan has not proven any strong enough evidence of social economic need to be living in such an area. Therefore, planning permission cannot be given solely because Mr. Corrigan desires to live in the countryside.
Thank you, Ms. Corcoran. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank all our guests here for their contributions. It's been a very enlightening conversation, one that I believe will give our viewers at home a better understanding of this issue. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for the weather, and we wish you a nice, calm evening.